Good morning. Today we look at John 12, verses 1 through 26. And this is Jesus he's been hanging out up at Ephraim since the raising of Lazarus from the dead. And there's so much more, that could be talked about with yesterday's reading. But 6 days, chapter 12 begins 6 days before the Passover. Jesus came again to Bethany. And so he'd been, I don't know how long he'd been at Ephraim there after Lazarus had been raised from the dead, but he returns to Bethany, to the home of Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. And they gave a dinner for him, it says. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those at the table with him. And, the high priest and everybody were really watching for Jesus, wondering, is he going to show up? Is he going to come? And there was, a warrant out for his arrest, basically, you could say. They were ready to arrest him at any time if they saw him and found out where he was. But Jesus wasn't afraid of that, wasn't deterred by that, because he knew what was going to happen. Anyway, he comes and he's at the table. Martha is serving, and Mary takes this jar of costly perfume and anoints his feet and wipes them with her hair. And the house is filled with the sweet fragrance of the perfume. This morning when I walked out the door, the air is filled with the not so sweet fragrance of smoke from the massive fires up in Canada. And, that's just another one of those devastations that's there, that they need our prayers. They need an awful lot of help up there right now. But so we know what the fragrance is, and these sweet fragrance, that reminds me, you walk in to the house, you go into a cafe and you smell the meat cooking, the whatever, those sweet fragrance that way. And so this was the way the house smelled, wonderful that way. And but we know that Judas took offense at this waste, and John editorially maybe tells us that Judas was a thief, and maybe that was part of the reason he was so upset, but also, I mean, they didn't understand, that what Jesus said, she has anointed me, leave her alone. She has bought it so that she might keep it for the day of my burial. Well, this is 6 days before the Passover. This is a few days before Jesus is going to be crucified on the cross. But yet he recognizes what she has done for him. And he says, you have always the poor with you, but you do not always have me. And Jesus may have said that, but we truly believe that Jesus, that God is with us no matter where we go, no matter what we do, that, God is present. He is wherever we are. He's as close to us as our breath, but they didn't have he was meaning the living Jesus with them, the one to teach them, to lead them, to guide them, to encourage them, by his life. But he still encourages us by his life today. And he is indeed with us in many ways. Verse 9 says, when the great crowd of Jews learned that he was there in Bethany, this great crowd of Jews came, not only because of Jesus, but also to see Lazarus. And Lazarus too had a death warrant out on him, because the chief priests realized that it was because of this seventh sign, Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, that many were beginning to believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And, well, they can't have that, can they? No. And so they were not only looking to put Jesus to death, get rid of him, but also to get rid of Lazarus because of the witness that he was. And you know what it says, verse 11, it was on account of him, Lazarus, that many of the Jews were deserting their faith, deserting the synagogue, deserting the teachings of the high priests and everything, and were believing in Jesus. These high priests were they were watching Jesus. They were aware of Jesus, but yet they couldn't quite get on the boat, with Jesus. They just, he just wasn't what they were expecting. And so when people started listening and following, and this movement began, it was scary. It was terrifying. And it's, we know what that's like. The first steps of a journey, the first, the new beginnings, can be scary. And for these chief priests, that things were out of their control, and they were used to being in control, and that in itself too was scary for them. But they were believing in Jesus. They were flocking to see him. And in verse 12, the next day, the great crowd that had come to the festival heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. So now we have Palm Sunday, 6 days before the Passover. And we recognize Palm Sunday every year, and remembering that Jesus came riding in on this donkey. And this is what, again, John tells us that, the people heard, and they brought branches of palm trees and went to meet him, shouting, "Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, the King of Israel." And they were excited. And the chief priests were astonished. They were aghast at such a thing. It's just more and more that we're just, chalking up things against Jesus. And, then it's, Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it, as it is written. So here John quotes for us, some of the prophecy about Jesus. "Do not be afraid, daughter of Zion. Look, your king is coming, sitting on the colt of a donkey." And so another one of the prophecies of the Old Testament about the Messiah that, again, the chief priests couldn't wrap their heads around. And verse 16 tells us his disciples didn't understand these things either. But when Jesus was glorified, and this is, John, the gospel writer John talks about Jesus being glorified, the glory of Jesus. And, the hardest thing to wrap our heads around is that the glory of Jesus was his death on the cross and his resurrection then from the dead by God. That Jesus saw his journey through to the end. He talks about, especially when we get into chapter 17, and tomorrow we have Jesus' prayer for us as our gospel reading. But, the glory of Jesus, the glorification of Jesus comes that way. And, so John tells us they didn't understand, but when Jesus was glorified, they remembered that these had been written about him and done to him. And they were, verse 17 says, the crowd that had been with him when he called Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to testify. How could they not? How could they not testify to what had happened, what they had seen? I mean, I don't know how many people were at the tomb with Jesus when that happened, but, there had been many mourners at the house with Mary and Martha. And as Mary went to see Jesus, many of them followed her. And Jesus said to her, "Where have they laid him?" And, boom. So there was quite a few people there anyway. And the Pharisees were just upset by this. It was because they had heard that Jesus had raised the dead that the crowd went to meet him. And the Pharisees said to one another, "You can do nothing. The world has gone after him. The world has gone crazy. Look at all this, And it was that way, it seemed like. And then there's another little short interlude here. There were some Greeks at this festival, foreigners, at the festival preparing for the Passover. And they went to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee. It just reminds us where his roots are. Philip told Andrew, Andrew and Simon Peter were brothers, and they went to tell Jesus, that these Greeks wanted to see him. And we don't know for sure if Jesus met with these Greeks or not. John doesn't tell us that. But his answer was, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified." And, you know, therefore, if a grain of wheat falls into the ground, it bears much fruit. And we understand, you know, this planting of the seed, especially in the springtime now. The tractor went by this morning with a big old planter behind it, and another tractor went by with a roller on it, and there's over in the field not so far away rolling beans. And we understand that seed falling into the ground and bringing new life. And this is what Jesus does for us. He was buried in the ground after his death. He was raised from the dead to give us new life. Tomorrow morning we have worship at 9 live on Facebook from Mabel and Sutton. It'll be a Holy Communion service. And then again at 10:30 I have worship at Our Savior's